What is Battletech? I don't ask that just in the context of it being a tabletop game, but also in the context of the world itself. Well, the answer to that might be a little less simple than you imagine, but it does lead into a subject that we'll be talking about today. Battletech is a universe created by FASA back in the 1980s, and is in its 4th decade of development. However, what this setting and game is today is not the setting or game that it was in the 1980s. What does this mean? There are many ideas that have been left in the dustbin of history for the setting as it has progressed. Many of which are missed by some, but most definitely aren't by others. In this piece, which is one of my infamous opinion videos, I'm going to discuss one controversial idea, and lay out to all of you why I hold that idea with dismissive contempt. It is a subject that I am covering simply because of the number of people who've begun bringing this up with me directly, and from what I've seen in the community at large. Since the arrival of the latest Urban Mech box set, one which lets it fly on the wings of angels, you might say. Much like my infamous Clan Wolf disclaimer video, I only create pieces like this when I feel compelled to action, rather than delivering such commentary simply out of want, I can assure you. So without any further preamble, if you'll give me a few minutes of your time, I'm going to discuss with all of you something I'd rather frankly not. Why I hate Land-Air-Mechs. I know this may sound crazy, but Battletech as a game came into existence for a wide variety of reasons. It was not something that just inherently emerged from the innermost sanctums of someone's mind, and then was made manifest. Battletech started actually because of a series of events, and that started with borrowing concepts from outside of FASA, which was a fledgling company at the time. And this did not just affect the game in terms of its tabletop gameplay, but in shaping the narrative and general theme of what it was, and what it would become. I remember at KerenskyCon 2024 in Chicago, to my recollection I'm retelling what Jordan Weissman said correctly in this, he was asked a question about the origins of the game, and one of the biggest components of it was discovering small-scale mecha models at a convention. This was public knowledge before, but just that's the freshest memory to my mind. And I think best demonstrates kind of how everything starts getting pasted together. Through licensing and further work, Battletech, as it would become, took famous designs from Macross, Crusher Joe, and Dougram. This meant that they were free to use what would later become the Unseen in the setting. So, that meant the adoption of mechs like the Shadowhawk, Marauder, Warhammer, and others. But it also meant access to other things, beyond what you'd just describe as typical mecha. This included things like the Scorpion, but also something specifically from Macross. Now, as most of you know, Macross in North America was distributed by the much beloved company called Harmony Gold, who named their interpretation of this Robotech. This show was aimed towards a younger audience, and had something very unique for its time. Well, kind of unique for its time, as similar concepts existed in Transformers shortly thereafter, though that's another story. That thing I'm talking about are Veritech fighters. What is a Veritech fighter, you may ask? Well, it's a jet fighter that transforms into a battle mech, or can shift into a half-mech, half-jet mode. This lets the machines fight on the ground, hover like a helicopter, or fly like a jet fighter, or even a spaceship. At the time, tons of kids and teenagers thought this was pretty awesome, and you know what, in the context of Macross, I guess it is pretty awesome. The series is really built around them, as in, they are the vehicle of choice to represent the main protagonists, basically every time. I'm not much of a Macross or Robotech fan though, but I understand the appeal. Now, with all of these things, battle mechs, quad vehicles, transforming, flying super machines, and eventually other original creations, FASA put together the core game of Battletech, a game of armored combat. That game, of course, is still with us today, even with some changes from its original inception. Still, the game, for a lot of people, was just an opportunity to play Robotech. as much as it was to wander into the still forming world of Battletech. And speaking of which, this is where my disdain for lambs, narratively, really comes from. But don't worry, I also despise their rules, and we'll talk about that a bit later too. There can sometimes be this strange view of these early days, that somehow things have not deviated since the early writings of the setting, or even that the earliest writings are consistent with what came later in the 1990s. This is plainly not true. Mechs and even battles depicted in this primordial time for the series add a degree of fluidity and dexterity to the war machines of the setting that really begin to vanish around the late 80s and early 90s, and very much disappear by the mid-90s. Early mechs very much have a bit more in common with their anime roots, and lambs inside the setting begin to make more sense with that in context. But by the time of the release of Technical Readout 3050, which was in 1991, years before the lawsuit that would create the unseen, it became extremely clear that Battletech had just moved on from them. Battle mechs were now lumbering Goliaths, with even lighter mechs being stiffer and emphasizing the machines being lords of the battlefield, more so than anime protagonists. There are reasons for this clearly. To begin with, the franchise had clearly tried to differentiate itself, trying to make itself more unique from the other IPs that had boosted its initial release. Another reason I'm going to speculate here is by the 90s, video games had started to become a major factor for Battletech, and the literature and games perhaps converged with that. Even by the time you look at the Battletech cartoon, once more in the early 90s, the battle mechs within are stiff, even when not animated in 3D. But you know what they really were? Unique. Battletech may have started off as a vehicle for people to play Robotech, but by Mechwarrior 2, people were playing Battletech for the sake of it, not for the sake of another property. So, the setting moved on from the agility of Macross. But where does that leave the lambs? As I mentioned 4 years prior to the infamous Harmony Gold lawsuit, when TRO 3050 was released, which contained, in its original print runs, the unseen designs, lambs were nowhere to be found. Yes, there were still in-universe justifications for why this happened. The factories were shut down, spare parts were low, but that's not really what took place. This happened, quite clearly to me, because they didn't fit anymore. In a setting where mechs use jump jets, sloppily, and stride with the mechanical grace of a glorified tractor, it's just frankly hard to sell that a mech is going to leap in the air, and in a 10-second period while still otherwise moving, will transform itself into a jet fighter and take off at high speed, where it will then perform potential dogfights or bombing runs, in this state, I should add. Just the transformation alone, by the technology displayed even from the High Star League through to the clans, is frankly utterly preposterous. This is the single biggest sticking point for me. Lambs feel alien to the setting, because they feel like holdovers of something that was stapled onto the very early iteration of Battletech. I don't care about a joke machine like the Irby Lamb, but I certainly don't want to see the return of a Phoenix Hawk Lamb, or anything else of the sort. Why? Because to me it breaks the immersion. I fundamentally don't believe that the Inner Sphere, Star League, or clans, based on their technology and engineering exploits, and based on what they have demonstrated they can really do outside of lambs themselves, can create such craft. They don't make sense. They don't click in the context of what the universe is. And if these factions could build them, I do not believe that they'd not build more of them. The costs be damned. Veritech fighters would be a pretty big boon for anyone fielding them. And that just takes away from the actual mechs, the actual core center of the setting. I don't care about flying super mechs. It's ridiculous. They're just not Battletech. Not as it's really been for around 35 of its 40 years. The world moved on from them. Even when reading Yesterday's Enemy, a short story by Lance Skrinski, I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong, but so I do apologize, Lance. I should also add who I very much respect in terms of his stories that I've read so far. And this is a story that appeared in the first issue of Shrapnel. Even the cool parts of the story just don't feel like there's something that should or could be in Battletech. But this is just my opinion. I'm just building an argument based on my experiences and built on where the setting has been. So yes, for these reasons, I am not a fan of lambs. That doesn't even begin to count the gameplay side of things. Before we get started, I'm just going to begin this by saying that I actively refuse to play against lambs. I would never personally deploy one against a human being either. Not only for an immersion point of view, which is important to me, but from a gameplay point of view. I have my interstellar operations alternate eras to hand, and I'm going to briefly go over the core parts of the rules for these things with all of you here, as well as how they will typically be used and why they are a problem. In other words, this is me really saying, if the lore weren't bad enough, well, the gameplay definitely adds an extra level of worse. Before delving specifically into the Lamb's rule set, I'm going to talk a bit about a game of armored combat. Because tactical battles are won on positioning, and this is a tactical game. Logistics win wars, of course, but flanking your opponent and upsetting their ability to operate is a surefire way to win a battle. Inferior forces have defeated superior ones on positioning. And in the case of Battletech, guess what? This is very much true still. If you have an advantage in movement and terrain, and your opponent can't bring you to favorable engagements on their own terms, then you have a very strong chance of winning. Unless the dice hate you, of course. It is always possible for a lucky shot to change the dynamics of any battle. But the truth is, if you weigh things in your favor, you wildly increase your chances of winning. Now, why do I say this? Because lambs functionally do this out the gates. Especially the one that everyone talks about by default. The Phoenix Hawk Lamb. So, how do lambs operate in-game? Prepare for the boring part of all of this, I apologize. It deploys in one of three modes: aerospace mode, air mech mode, or mech mode. Mech mode is basically just a mech, and usually one the Lamb is based on, like the Wasp, Stinger, or Phoenix Hawk. A rare exception, of course, being the Word of Blake's dedicated lambs. Aerospace mode is when it's configured into being a fighter, and given the way aerospace rules are at the moment, this can be tedious to operate or unfun for your opponent to play against if bringing bombs to the game. And then there is air mech mode, which is really the only mode someone's going to take a lamb in after their bombing run. Because if you want to drain the fun out of your friends, that's what this is for. So let's begin digging in. When you want to convert between modes, you need to make a piloting skill check, and it's got to be declared at the beginning of your turn. When converting, you maintain your previous movement type, i.e., if you are on the ground, it's ground movement, if you're in the air, it's air movement, and your movement totals are halved and rounded down. You can also transform your lamb every movement phase if you really want to. But you won't, because you'll probably be in air mech mode. They also ditch any battle armor that they are transporting at this time of transformation, or if they are swarmed by them. Doing this while being swarmed by normal infantry kills some of said infantry. In both cases, the lamb will have to roll to see if it takes a critical hit, while performing this roll to a random location. I wish it was always to the cockpit. That would definitely improve the game. If you take critical hits to the shoulder, upper arm, or lower arm, they prevent the lamb from transforming into battle mech mode. But don't worry, you'll just never transform into that mode. It can still convert between fighter and air mech mode, because that's all you really want to play as anyway. Crit to the legs, it's the same thing, just it means it can't convert from fighter mode to something else. But it can still go from battle mech to air mech mode and the reverse. Gyro hit though, you're finished. No transforming anymore. Lambs literally have 10 pages of rules in Battletech Interstellar Operations Alternate Eras, so I'm not going to go over every single line here, but I figure telling you about their transformations matters. And by the way, you'll also need Total War to understand how some of their movement rules operate when it comes to air-mech mode. Again, the only mode that anyone who plays LAMs ever really uses. Also, the reason why it has so many pages of rules and why you need other rulebooks to fully understand this is because Battletech needs more bloat. Truth be told, I really don't think that they needed 10 pages of rules though in this, because as I mentioned, no one is really going to ever use these to transform unless it's from jet mode to air-mech mode, after they have dropped a bombing run. LAMs are almost entirely deployed in this state, or in a state where they are an aerospace fighter with bombs, and then they turn into that state. This is the main mode that people who want to play an anime superhero on the tabletop want, and it is fundamentally what independently breaks the game. Air-mechs can walk, albeit not very far, and they can fly, quite far for a tabletop game, and they're almost always going to fly as a result. Now why is that? Because in air-mech mode, their cruise movement points is 3 times the mech's jumping ability, meaning that a mech that can jump 6 has a LAM cruise in air-mech mode of 18 hexes. Flanking is even faster in this instance. It generates 1 point of heat per 1/3 of your movement, so if you move 15, which is pretty close to jump 15 but not quite, you generate 5 points of heat. Seems fair to me. Quite the bargain, even. This movement type does count as a modified form of wing in-ground effect, which is a specific type listed in Total Warfare. They have some of the same restrictions, things like maintaining at least 1 level of elevation when in flight mode, but the exceptions list is pretty long, because once more, anime protagonists can't be restricted by wing in-ground effect, my friends. So let's complicate this thing. Just as a quick aside, because it does come up, in space, air-mech mode operates like using space drops for ground units in 0G, and 0G ground unit combat rules. Their thrust rate is basically the same as their cruise rate. A LAM in air-mech mode may choose to hover, just like they do in Robotech, so you can acquire your maximum Robotech experience. It costs 5 movement points though, which you won't care about because you have a movement total of a bajillion. Air-mechs can move between 0 and 4 while in hovering mode and remain airborne, though they still need to spend the extra 5 movement points to maintain this. A hovering air-mech is also never considered an immobile target. Fun fact, you will definitely have the movement points to do this, so I really don't see why they insist on you doing it, because, let's be real, most of these things have a cruise of like 15 or more. So, the biggest change? While wing and ground effect have really brutal restrictions in regards to elevation, more or less not really being able to climb and having to deal with more obstructions. But anime superheroes don't have these pedestrian Battletech problems, you see. Air-mechs can just spend 1 movement to go up or down on the elevation ladder, and can reach a maximum elevation of 25 above whatever terrain they are hovering over, though staying at a higher elevation and moving further does cost movement points. This is because their movement becomes less effective, with them having to spend 2 movement points per hex instead of 1, unless it is at 1 elevation above the ground. It also doesn't need to end its turn at elevation 1, like a normal wing and ground effect vehicle, because that'd not be cool, and that would be very not anime, obviously. Air-mechs can land without making a PSR, unless they have a leg or gyro problem. They can also stack with other units at various elevations, though I'm not going to delve deep into that here, as this just applies to VTOLs and aerospace fighters and etc. and other formats too. While flanking, air-mechs are capable of slide slipping, which is kind of bad, but it's also really unlikely if you buy down your pilot skill for the machine. In essence though, this means that the mech can slip, crash, and literally burn or even explode, but this is something that really only happens when you deploy a 4-5 LAM. This is, in fact, probably why there is a chorus of folks who think that LAMs suck. A 3-2 pilot LAM or a 2-1 pilot is just really unlikely to face many consequences for something like this though. Yes, it is extra BV, but your opponent is never really going to be able to engage the LAM as a result. Almost ever. If you play correctly. Which means it doesn't really matter how big your opponent is or how few guns your LAM has. Rear armor is almost always vulnerable. Also, if you're playing in objective-based games, the LAM can just swoop in and take the objective. But I digress from this side tangent. I guess we talked about pilots now. But yeah, people buy down their pilots, and it completely erodes and removes most of the weaknesses LAMs were built to have, and separate LAMs from standard battle mechs that just would not have these problems in the first place. And these were clearly put in to limit the usage of these vehicles. Some of this also touches on Air Mech mode's other supposed weakness, in that they suffer from the vehicle turning rules, as found in Tactical Operations Advanced Rules. Yet another rulebook you'll need if you want to fight your battles, while listening to Min-Mei sing, "Do You Remember Love?" This basically calculates the movement modifiers you face while taking into account how far the vehicle is moving versus its weight on if it's going to have a problem after turning. Again, a 2-pilot or a 1-pilot is probably not going to care much unless there are extreme maneuvers taking place. And finally, let us begin talking about combat. Because they are airborne, guess what? They are a +1 to hit as a TMM. When factoring in how far they move, SpaghettiOs. Look at the movement profiles of these kinds of machines, even when they are in cruise mode, and you'll begin to understand the problem here. Now, mechs aren't always going to move in a straight line, but it's pretty likely that a mech cruising at 15 or 18 has a really strong chance of moving at least 10 hexes in a single turn. You know what that means? +5 TMM. But more importantly, it also means being able to control whenever and wherever the battle is really going to take place. Let's say your opponent has a plasma rifle as a main armament, and you have a snub-nosed PPC, like a late-generation Phoenix Hawk. Awesome. You move 11 hexes in total after winning the initiative, and you get to 6 hexes of your opponent. They now have a +7 to hit you, 5 for your movement, 2 for the range bracket, and let's say that they walked, that's +8. For a standard pilot, they now need boxcars to hit with their plasma rifle. If they ran, it is now an impossible shot. Let's say the pilots are even, and it's a 3-2 pilot in the machine. So now they have an 11 to hit, and if they ran, a 12. The LAM, however, only has a +3 for their entire movement. They're in short range because of the snub-nosed PPC. The opponent will say walked 4. So what does that mean for the LAM? They're hitting on 7s. Even if they ran 5, it's only an 8. For any backup weaponry, 9s and 10s potentially. But this is even providing that the LAM is going to engage the enemy on that angle where they can actually be fired upon easily. In reality, for the most part, after winning initiative, they will simply attack the target from behind every turn. What happens if they lose the initiative? It has the speed to literally just vacate, as it can easily spend 20 movement points to run and hide and get to a ridiculous range band, staving off any reprisals from the enemy team. Now, will this win the game? Not necessarily, but you know what it will do? It will suck every moment of fun out of the experience. It's literally designed in such a way that someone taking one of these, if they use them correctly, will skirt the combat zone and just strike from behind at every opportunity, hitting on 6s, 7s, or 8s from the rear. Light mechs can do this too, but light mechs can be caught, and light mechs are certainly not that hard to hit by comparison. Even when forced into less than ideal frontages, it can just force range bands that only help it. I know these tactics quite well because they work when you're playing a lance of medium strikers, and LAMs are just this on steroids. What is the hard counter to this? Clan Pulse weaponry with targeting computer, LBX autocannons, and silver bullets are all pretty okay. But the problem is, the LAM, even when facing down these very impressive weapons, is going to choose the engagement and attack vectors in most games. It sounds great to use a pair of Clan large pulse lasers to shoot one down, until it flies in at 16 hexes away and has moved over 18 hexes in total, is now +6 to hit, or just +4 if we take into account the pulse to hit bonus. But you're at long range, so it's now really +8, and then the turn after, it's behind your mech, forcing you to make terrible battlefield decisions and considerations, which is the whole point of outpositioning your opposition. Even if it is not engaging, it is going to force your opponent to behave in such a way that it will hinder their movement and tactics on the field. Because if they ignore this thing, it will just shoot them in the back every turn. And guess what? You cannot survive being shot in the back every turn for very long, even in a heavy mech. That's not even taking into account that the Lamb has fellow mechs and vehicles on the field to contend with still as well. So even trying to trap it is unlikely to happen, as you will hinder yourself against the rest of the team. Battletech, I have to reiterate, is a game of positioning. When your opponent can just out-position you, without much that can be done about it, doing so in a fashion that'd make a light mech blush, there is a fundamental problem. To give context, a fire moth would be a victim of most lambs, because a fire moth cannot move like a lamb. There are additional weaknesses that lambs face though. They suffer worse PSRs when taking fire, for instance. But if you buy down your piloting skill, who cares? They also are more likely to receive critical hits. Again, outside of lucky shots, if you're using them correctly, you're just not going to be shot. Even if you are, okay, well, you don't win them all, but you do frustrate your opponent all the same. The real issue with these things, just on the gameplay front, is that they are plainly so aggravating to play against, even destroying them or winning the game just isn't worth the experience of having to deal with them. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, as it were. And this says nothing of objective-based games, which I will reiterate from earlier. This is because the movement abilities of the Lamb will definitely exploit anything that requires capturing or scouting. It's absurd. Why would you even bother bringing the rest of your lance? I used to play a blue control deck forever ago, when I played Magic the Gathering. And I'll also say I was a much worse person in this respect. I built the deck just to control the board, without any clear win strategy. I lost plenty of games. That wasn't even the point of why I was playing though, because my opponents had the least fun in their lives. The objective was to garner amusement through frustration, rather than through embracing the spirit of the game. I am deeply ashamed of playing this way now, I should add, many years later. Lambs are the embodiment of that, just in Battletech. Once you get through their web of Byzantine and special rules, you find something that is distilled down to: it's a bad mech you won't use, it's an aerospace fighter you don't need, and it's the most frustrating designed machine in history in its unique air mech mode for your opponents. The Savannah Master wave is almost more welcoming than seeing a lamb on the other side of the table. Even while writing this, to make sure that I wasn't crazy, as it has been a while since I ran into one of these game-breaking disasters, I ran a few test games on Megamech against Princess the Bot, who always had more battle value than me, and 2 to 3 mechs in total on their side. And the Phoenix Hawk with snub-nosed PPC I brought literally slaughtered them every time. Now, Princess isn't the sharpest, and a human would have been more cunning, but they rarely even managed to score hits, because when you need 11s and 12s under best-case scenarios, you just don't do anything. Why did I not do this against people, you may ask? Because honestly, I despise lambs so much that even while playing this, I was beyond annoyed. Just wanted to be reminded how broken mechanically they were. Were they as bad as I remembered? Absolutely. In the exact same scenarios, with just normal mechs on my part, even fast lights, the situation would have been far different. Just because they'd actually be able to be in position at some point to attack me on their terms. Now, to be clear though, to completely remove my opposition in some games took between 12 and 18 turns, which is beyond what most game lengths would be. Obviously, a lot of objective games have turn-based restrictions, but this demonstrates how absolutely frustrating it is to have to deal with these kinds of supposed game pieces. If you want to suck the fun out of the game, these are great tools for doing that. And you get to do it while pretending that Battletech is still even loosely connected to Macross. What an incredible win. Still, I got a renewed full anime experience. Something I've never really wanted Battletech for. I thought very little of it. Just as a quick aside, I am aware that some people will make the argument that buying down the pilot skill of a battle mech would yield comparative results. This is not the case, because even with a better pilot, a battle mech will be overwhelmed by enemy numbers with time, whereas the Lamb can choose when it's going to engage and what target it will isolate and destroy. Another argument might be that VTOLs can do very similar things, but VTOLs and wing-in ground movement vehicles are still vehicles for the purposes of Battletech and do suffer more weaknesses as a result. Whereas technically the LAM has a series of weaknesses, again, these are actually offset by simply buying down its pilot skill. VTOLs also are significantly more fragile, even when heavily armored. I hate lambs. I mean, that was pretty obvious from the title. I know it's shocking. Sometimes in these videos, you'll find I will sneak something in, where I'll add a note that I have somehow improved my views on these things in some way, or that there are virtues to be found somewhere. But you're not going to find that here. I think lambs are relics from before Battletech was established as a franchise, and that they have been left in the setting only because of the nature of how Mechwarrior and Battletech don't really discard their follies, but just let them fade away. However, with the arrival of the Urban Mech Lamb, a comedic meme product from Catalyst Game Labs, there has been a rising chorus, even if a quiet one, of voices asking for these blighted things to make a return. Not only is their very existence hard to swallow, as despite official lore saying to the contrary, they are very obviously nimbler and superior to standard battle mechs in basically every way. I know, they can't use XL engines, they can't use specialist armor, and they also can't use a series of other equipment like endosteel. That genuinely doesn't matter, as they are literally just anime protagonist machines even in the fiction, but their rules are also convoluted and frankly broken. There is only so much you can staple onto a game engine before it starts to break, and from the very start, lambs have not fit in Battletech. They have always broken the game engine, even as more weaknesses have been tagged onto them. It simply doesn't matter. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, the original lamb rules were even more brutal than the latest iteration of them. It's absurd. By the time I'd started to play Battletech myself in the early 90s, the setting had firmly established itself really into what it actually was. Mechs were behemoths, striding over the battlefield, acting as walking battle tanks, rather than mechanized 40-foot acrobats. Lambs are something Battletech does not need, and they don't bring anything of value to it. Battletech is not Macross. It is not Gundam. It is Battletech. The main other machine-based robot franchise I enjoy is Transformers. And my absolute favorite kinds of Transformers are the Seekers, with Starscream being at the top of the pack for me. The thing is, Battletech is a poor place to have transformations. They don't feel grounded. Putting Starscream in the game isn't going to be awesome. It's going to be lame. I just want Battletech and Mechwarrior to be Battletech and Mechwarrior, both in story and in gameplay. Thank you all for joining me here today. I absolutely hated making this. I'm really not a big fan of making negative videos, almost in general, ever. But just because I had announced this about a month ago, and because I really felt, just after hearing so much from the community, and just after having enough people poke me about it and seeing enough discourse in it in the community earlier this year, I really felt I needed to make this video. I never really like making these types of videos though, as I mentioned. It's just, kind of against my nature. When it comes to sitting down and writing a video, it's a lot more fun to sit down and write something that you're excited about, rather than sitting down and writing something that you would rather remove one of your fingers than embrace. As you can tell, not much of a lamb guy, no. So, thank you all for being here while I go over my list of many grievances against these things. Don't expect another video like this for a very long time. I'm going to actually be doing a video next talking about just kind of the art direction for Mechwarrior 5 and which mechs I like more than the CGL ones. I will spoil that in general I actually like the direction of the CGL design a little bit more, but I think both are fantastic. It's just going to be a video where I really go over which ones I think Mechwarrior 5 knocks out of the park. Or Mechwarrior Online / Mechwarrior 5 / Mechwarrior 5 clans. And then after that, I'm actually going to be working on a big Taurian Concordat video about the Taurian Concordat in its entirety. It is the first video of its type I've really considered doing. I guess the closest thing I've done so far is the Origins of Comstar, parts 1 and 2. But in this case, it's going to be one big video talking about the Taurian Concordat, and that's what it's going to be. If you enjoyed this content, and why would you? If you enjoyed this content, this is not my normal type of video, but still, I would appreciate a like, and subscribing does help. Remember, smash that like button, as most YouTubers will say. And I also want to give a huge shout out to all of the YouTube channel members who support the content I make. Thank you so much, I really appreciate your support. This would not be possible without you guys. I appreciate it. However, with all of that being said, what do you all think? Do you agree with me? Do you not agree with me? Do you not care? All of those answers are perfectly satisfactory, and I would love to see them in the comments section below.